Welcome one and all to our Living Room Lecture Series, and thank you for joining us. Tonight's presentation is titled A Field Guide to Archaeological Oddities, Frauds, and Mysteries with Professor Emeritus Dr. Kenneth Fetter. My name is Adam Easley, and I am the Public Archaeology Coordinator at the San Diego Archaeological Center. For those of you joining us for the first time, the SDAC is a nonprofit museum, education, and research facility where visitors can learn the story of how people have lived in San Diego County for the past 12,000 years. Founded in 1993, the center was the first private nonprofit dedicated to the care, management, and use of archaeological collections. Come on by and visit our museum, which is located in the picturesque San Pasqual Valley in Escondido, 1 mile east of the San Diego Safari Park. Registration is now open for our Kids Dig Archaeology Summer Camp for ages 6 through 12. This July, our expert guides will lead your kids through a variety of hands-on activities, including basketry, local hiking, honing your archery and atlatl skills, crafting pottery, ancient games, and decoding Ice Age rock art from around the world. Sibling discounts and extended care hours are available. Space is limited, though. You can find more information and sign up now on our website, sandiegoarchaeology.org. Details on these events and other information about the center, our curation efforts, and programs can also be found on the same website. Tonight, we will be using the Q&A feature. You can find it on your Zoom control panel. Feel free to submit questions at any time, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation during the moderated Q&A. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Kenneth Fetter. Dr. Fetter is Professor Emeritus in Anthropology at Central Connecticut State University in New Britain, Connecticut. His primary research interests include the archaeology of the native peoples of New England and the analysis of public perceptions about the human past. He is the author of several great books, including Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience in Archaeology, The Past in Perspective, An Introduction in Human Prehistory, and Ancient America, 50 Archaeological Sites to See for Yourself, and Archaeological Oddities, a field guide to 40 claims of lost civilizations, ancient visitors, and other strange sites in North America. He has also served as a talking head on numerous television documentaries where, on the topic of human antiquity, one producer even described him as being, quote, a beacon of sanity in a sea of madness. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor to introduce to you Dr. Ken Fetter.
Hey, thank you very much, Adam. And thank you all for logging on tonight to talk about some weird archaeology, strange archaeology, archaeological oddities. My name is Ken Fetter, and indeed, I am an archaeologist, have been for more than 50 years now, probably, and was a professor of anthropology, specializing in archaeology at Central Connecticut State University for more than 40 years. Now, what I'm going to try to do is, hold on. I'm trying to start my, oh, here we go. Here we go. So there's my title. Now, yeah, I am field archaeologist. That's me on the left at a 3,000-year-old soapstone quarry in northwestern Connecticut. It's a quarry where the soft stone was extracted from the ground for making bowls and platters and pots, generally before the advent of ceramics in this part of the world, which is about 3,000 years ago. That's me over on the right, here, right there, photographing some rock art in Dinosaur National Monument. So along with my field archaeology, I'm also an author and have written a number of books. And one of the themes of my books is trying to inspire folks, to encourage them to go out and engage directly with the archaeological record. So go and visit sites that are open to the public. These are protected places, and to see for yourself the amazing the time depth and the beauty and the brilliance and the creativity of Native Americans as reflected by the archaeological record, reflected in that record. As an author, I am probably best known for this book that Adam mentioned, Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience in Archaeology. And yes, this is a shameless self-promotion that I'm doing now, and I'm very much ashamed, but you know, that's the way it goes. My favorite review, this book is used all over the US and Canada in archaeology courses that focus on kind of popular topics in archaeology. Things like Atlantis, things like ancient aliens, the Cardiff Giant, Piltdown Man, and a host of other topics. And my favorite review by a colleague, an anonymous colleague of this book, is that Thader's book is filled with humor. It is like giving your dog a pill wrapped in cheese. And I got to tell you, I like cheese and I like dogs, so I'm very happy with that review. Anyway, so that's one of the themes of my writing and my research. As I mentioned, I also am all about convincing people, inspiring people, encouraging them to go out and see archaeological sites, visit them for themselves, national parks and national monuments, on private properties, state parks, and so on, especially places where there are museums and there's interpretive centers, because that's the best way to really learn about this vast and wondrous history that we have here in North America. And this is one of those books. This is Ancient America, 50 Archaeological Sites to See for Yourself. Now, this book was published by Rowman and Littlefield several years ago. And I worked with a fantastic editor there, Leanne Silverman. And she really gets, all credit is due Leanne to making this book beautiful and successful. And when the book was finally done, this is kind of common. When the book was finished, in the sense that I had written the book, the thing had been typeset, whatever the equivalent is in computer ease. The index was written, the preface was written, it was ready to go to the printer. It was ready to actually be printed out. And so there's nothing more I could do. No more fixes, no more tweaking. The book is ready. Leanne and I then spoke to one another in this period between us finishing the hard work and it actually being printed as physical copies. And so we were schmoozing, we were decompressing after a long period. This took a few years to complete. And so we were super happy about that. And, I figured we'd just be talking about this book. But Leanne then asked me a question that I was not prepared to answer. Now, I didn't have a set answer for her question because I didn't expect the question. What Leanne asked me at that moment was, okay, Kenny, so what's the topic of your next project with us? Now, as an author, you never want to tell a publisher, what are you, crazy? Let me relax for a little bit. You don't want to do that. If they seem interested in a project, you want to come up with something. But I had nothing planned. I really didn't. And so I just sort of panicked and synapses fired in my brain. And I said, well, yeah, okay, Leanne. Well, Leanne, how I'm pretty well known in the field for archaeological frauds, myths, and mysteries. And I've just written Ancient America, where people are visiting sites. It's like a travel guide. I'm thinking we could combine those two concepts. So I can write a travel guide. Remember, this is all off the top of my head, and I'm kind of building on this as I'm going, this elevator pitch that I hadn't even considered. I can write a travel guide to visit the sites that are open to the public that are, in fact, frauds, myths, or mysteries. Wouldn't that be a cool idea? Dead silence on the phone. And I'm thinking, well, that was a dumb idea. She knows that's a dumb idea. I wasn't prepared. I'll explain that I simply wasn't prepared. And then after a few moments of silence, seemed like a lifetime, Leanne said to me, hey, that's a really interesting idea. And of course I said, yeah, I thought it was. I wasn't really sure. She asked me at that moment, here, this book isn't even, the ink isn't even on the pages yet. And I'm working on a prospectus, a summary of what the next book will be all about. And within like a month or two, I had a contract for it. And the rest is history. The next couple of years, I worked on the book that's this amalgam of frauds and ancient America, Archaeological Oddities, a field guide to 40 claims of lost civilizations, ancient visitors, and other strange sites in North America. And just the cover should give you an idea of how strange some of these places are that I talk about. A concrete version of Stonehenge, incredible rock art that some people interpret as the pictorial representations of ancient aliens in America, and the Newport Tower, which it could be Viking, it could be Celtic, or it could actually be the base of the windmill for Benedict Arnold, not the guy who's like the traitor, but his grandfather. And so this book has 40 of these, 40 sites, 40 places where interesting questions are asked. I'm a skeptic for sure. I can be snarky. Yeah, I am. But it doesn't hurt to ask questions. Are these places real? Are they legitimate? What do they mean about our reconstructions of the antiquity of the New World. And I'm going to give you a handful of those today. But before I do, a little background about archaeology. I would tell my students in my classes that archaeology is sort of kind of like detective work. You know, detectives investigate the scene of a crime. Archaeologists investigate the scene of a life. All right, it's a metaphor. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think it does represent sort of what we do. Like detectives, we collect material evidence to answer questions about what happened, whether it was last week or a million years ago. And my role model in all of this has always been this guy, Sherlock Holmes. I've been a fan since I was a kid, and I grew up in New York, and the movies made between 1939 and 1946 was Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes and Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson. I loved those movies. So whenever I was on the weekends or when I was homesick, the local stations in New York, the independent stations, would show on kind of an endless loop, along with the horror movies, Dracula and Frankenstein, and along with the Marx Brothers and W.C. Fields. They also showed those 14 Sherlock Holmes movies, and I fell in love with them. And that inspired me to watch the Granada series, which came out of the UK in the 90s, which is far truer to the original stories. And that inspired me to read all of the stories, 56 short stories and 4 novels. Now, the reason I bring up Sherlock Holmes at all is material evidence based on an accumulation of cigar ash and the footprint of a gigantic hound. Holmes solves a crime. By noticing that a crusty residue was present in only one of the 3 wine glasses from which 3 criminals drank, a crime is solved. By recovering the evidence at the scene of a presumed murder, made all the more mysterious by, this is a famous quote, the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. I'm not going to tell you what that's about. No spoilers here. Read the story. It's a great story. More about that one in a little bit. So Holmes is able to reconstruct the scenes of these crimes and solve these crimes. Now that last one, I want to use that last one as a specific model. The short story in question is called The Adventure of Silver Blaze. You may notice that's a cat with a white marking on its nose. The Adventure of Silver Blaze in the story is actually a horse, but here our cat Olive, who I call Silver Blaze, I promised her I would include her in the PowerPoint. You know, you promise a cat something, you gotta live up to that promise. Silver Blaze, the horse, has that white blaze on its snout, and that actually becomes an important plot point later on in the story. Now, here's the deal in Silver Blaze. A very valuable racehorse goes missing, and its trainer is found dead. And the owner of the valuable racehorse brings in Sherlock Holmes to solve the crime. Now, these are screen grabs from the Granada series. And I want to show you how much like archaeology what Sherlock Holmes did to solve this crime, how similar it is. There's Jeremy Bratt, perfect Sherlock Holmes, on his stomach, excavating in the mud where the traitor's body was found. And you see there in the photograph on the right, the screen grab on the right, he's picked something up. Now, the police, the authorities have gone over this with a fine-tooth comb, but they found nothing. Stretching himself upon his face and leaning his chin upon his hands, he made a careful study of the trampled mud in front of him. "Hello," he said suddenly. "What's this?" It was a wax vesta, and it's a bird match. Half bird, which was so coated with mud that it looked at first like a little chip of wood. The inspector says, "I cannot think how I came to overlook it," with an expression of annoyance. What Sherlock Holmes then says is the key. "It was invisible, buried in the mud. I only saw it because I was looking for it." "What, you expected to find it?" the inspector says, and Holmes says, "I thought it not unlikely." Now, here's why that's key. After accumulating a vast storehouse of experience investigating criminality, Holmes knew exactly what to look for and what would be found if his working hypothesis about the crime were to be upheld. Holmes immediately thought something happened in that spot where the body was found that needed illumination. And so therefore, there would be a candle, there would be wax drippings, or there would be a a bird match that had lit a lamp. He knew that if the hypothesis were true. That's precisely how the disciplinary experience of archaeology informs its practitioners in assessing scenarios concerning the human past. Let me be more specific. Suppose your hypothesis is members of the lost tribes of Israel were living in New Mexico and Ohio 20,000 years ago. What if your hypothesis is the native people of Utah were eyewitness to pterodactyls flying in the Utah sky only a couple of thousand years ago? What if your hypothesis is those same native people who were eyewitness to extraterrestrial visitors to Earth? How about this one? Ancient Druids lived in New Hampshire 2,000 years ago. Or this, a lost civilization visited the Americas and taught native people astronomy. Or finally, ancient Egyptians lived in California. If those are your hypotheses, archaeologists are going to be able to provide a list of the material evidence that has to be found in order to support these claims or these hypotheses. Without that material evidence, the expected material evidence, I'll give you specifics in a sec, we cannot support these hypotheses. It doesn't mean we've disproved them. It means there's no affirmative positive evidence that any of these things were true. And I'm going to talk about each one of these in turn. Come on. There you go. Well, what I'm showing on the screen here is a broad sample of weaponry. Some are stone points. Some are metal. There's copper and brass, and there's a steel, modern steel arrow point. There's even a bone point, that yellow one, that yellowish one that's sort of a little bit to the left of the middle. Each of these weapons, each does the same thing. It's used either in war or in hunting. So they've accomplished the same purpose, but each one of them is made from a different raw material or a different kind of stone. Each one of them has a different form or shape. Each one of them is differently sized. Each one is a different color. The choices people make when they make their tools are informed by their culture. It's who taught them. How were they taught to do these things? Each one of these is efficient and effective, but the style of it differs according to how people were trained, how people were taught. The same is true for ceramics, vessels. These are all pottery, except for one. One's a ringer, but I'll tell you about that one. Made different times, different places, by different cultures. And in each case, it reflected the style, the traditions of those people at that time. So what I'm saying here is that artifacts, the things people make and use, are like they are the equivalent of fingerprints or footprints. Holmes was an expert in identifying footprints. He could tell you if it was a man or a woman. He could tell you what their weight was. He could tell you if they had a disability. He could tell you how quickly they were moving just based on the footprints. Well, again, to extend that metaphor out to its extreme, archaeologists find the footprints of people, and we can define those footprints, we can recognize and distinguish them. And so if you're telling me Druids were in New Hampshire, I'll tell you exactly what we need to find in order to support that hypothesis. If you tell me, oh, the ancient Israelites were living in New Mexico 2,000 years ago, cool hypothesis, nothing wrong with that hypothesis, but we know the kinds of evidence that must be found in order to support that hypothesis. By the way, the vessel on the lower left, not really pottery. That is a stone vessel made of steatite. So that site where I was sitting at a quarry where the soapstone or steatite, same thing, was being extracted from the ground. That stone is very soft and was used to create vessels, pots, all over the country, wherever steatite is found. And in fact, I've got somewhere in my records, I have a beautiful photograph of a steatite quarry in California. So not that far away from wherever you guys are, if you're in California. So arrow points and spear points, pottery, housing. Again, houses reflect the way people in a particular place at a particular time produce the places where they live. Obviously, different raw materials, depending on what's available in the area, different styles depending on what their ancestors did, different sizes and shapes. And, I guess the point I'm making here is each group leaves behind a mess, right? That's the archaeological record has been described as other people's garbage. So stuff that people made and used and lost and discarded and used up and left behind for safekeeping and never returned to. That's the archaeological record. And then each group of folks produces their own unique footprint based on how they were taught, how they passed these things down. The single most important word here is, the song from the Broadway show Fiddler on the Roof, where Tevye, the patriarch, is explaining his Jewish faith in 19th century Russia, living in this rural area. They're all farmers. And in the song in question, he's talking to himself or the audience on stage and says, you ask why we do these things this way. And his answer is, I don't know. But it's tradition. And that informs a lot of what I'm talking about here, is that we can distinguish different people based on how they make their stuff, what they make it out of, what their traditions are. Are there people who go against tradition? Absolutely. Are there innovators? Absolutely. And things change through time. But by and large, people are passing down their traditions, which involves making tools. It involves making houses. It involves making pottery. It involves how they cook, how they bury their dead, how they are supposed to culturally dispose of their trash. It's done by tradition. And archaeologists become really good, really practiced at identifying different people's traditions. Which brings me to this. One of the first questions I asked, what if your hypothesis has to do with, did ancient Jews live in America 1,000, 2,000 years ago? The lost tribes of Israel, the wandering Jews. We have a claim. The claim is from Los Lunas, New Mexico. Los Lunas is located, I don't think it's even an hour outside of Albuquerque, south and west of there. And in this place, there is a large rock that has a version of the Ten Commandments written on it. No question of that. On a stone, and the style of the writing is about 2,000 years old. Let's go to Los Lunas. There it is in western central New Mexico. It's a beautiful area. It's a volcanic landscape. So all those mountains you see are ancient the remnants of ancient volcanoes. And as you walk around, you see a lot of this black rock. The black rock is basalt for the most part. So that's volcanic rock. Imagine that lava coming out of those volcanoes and solidifying. As you walk by here, and it's about, from the trailhead, it's, I don't think it's even 2 miles. Can't remember exactly. It's not a very strenuous hike, and it takes you to this. Now you're looking at, see where that green arrow is? That is the Los Lunas Decalogue stone. An idea of how big it is. There's me squatting next to it. This is about 10 years ago. And that circle, I'm circling the message, that Hebrew, written from right to left. And I cannot read that Hebrew. People who can read that Hebrew say, yeah, well, it's a kind of stilted version of the Ten Commandments. Now, what's that doing in New Mexico at a site that, well, based on the writing style, it's about it's 1,000, 2,000 years old. What does that mean? Well, first, let's look at the writing itself. Let's look at the actual, before we do that, from where I'm that photograph I just showed you of me right in front of the Los Lunas Decalogue stone, if you turn 180 degrees and look across this little gully, you see that. Now I'm using a telephoto lens here, so it's a little, it's like a 10-second walk to it. And it's an actual Native American petroglyph. It's the real deal. I want you to look at that. I'm going to show you this picture again and a picture of a couple of the others. Notice that it's faded. the way this works is the basalt gets patinated. That is, the rock that's exposed gets buffeted by the wind, buffeted by the sand, rain hits it, and eventually it smooths the surface out and it stains it. It makes it a different color. And then native people in the area knew that if you scratch through the patina, you could expose this light color, which is part of the patina, and the contrast between that light and the dark made these things really pop. Once that scratch is made in the patina, it begins to repatinate. Takes a long time, but a very fresh scratch mark today will, over hundreds and thousands of years, slowly erode, slowly repatinate, and it begins to lose its luster. And that's an example of that in the case of this petroglyph. That's probably 1,000 to 2,000 years old, about the equivalent age of what's supposed to be what the Los Lunas Decalogue stone is supposed to look like. Now, just so you see the comparison, all right, there's the petroglyph. Now look in the upper right. That's modern graffiti. Boo, we don't want that. But what it allows us to do here is to show what a modern scratch in the rock is going to look like. Now that could have happened 5 years before I visited, maybe 10 years, probably not much more than that. But very clearly, that is bright. That is very light colored because it hasn't had a chance to repatinate, to darken. Compare that, obviously, to the petroglyph, which is a far different color. And that's the same rock, right? And the same patina, the same layer on the surface. Now look at this, right? There's the petroglyph. There's the modern graffiti, and there's the Los Lunas Decalogue stone. Pretty clearly, the lettering in the Los Lunas Decalogue stone is darker than the modern graffiti, so it's not a few years old, but it is much, much brighter than the petroglyph, which is between 1,000 and 2,000 years old. Now, I will tell you, the first recorded instance of that Decalogue stone existing is the 1930s. And the person who brought the archaeologist out to see it said that he remembered seeing it as a boy 50 years before. So that would, if in fact, my hypothesis is true, that it's a fake, it happened somewhere between 1930 and 1880, thereabouts, meaning, yeah, it's 100, 120 years old, 130 years old. But compare that to the modern graffiti that is on the upper right, which is much brighter, obviously not as old, and the petroglyph on the left, which is substantially older. Just in terms of a kind of a relative approach here, and I'm not applying, I really can't say this much darkening would happen over the particular span of years, but what I'm saying is, relatively speaking, that Los Lunas writing cannot be anywhere near as old as the petroglyph. Now let's look at another bit of evidence. All right, the green arrows are pointing to places where the patina exfoliated. It sloughed off. Water got in between the cracks of the stone. The patina is already weaker than the main stone. It froze, it thawed, and eventually these things popped off. So you're seeing that in a number of places. Notice that where it has exfoliated, the stone is black or very, very dark gray. That's the natural color of the stone. And where it's eroded up on top, you can see the same thing. But here's the deal. When you look at the lettering goes right through the exfoliation. The lettering, in fact, if you look very carefully, the lettering actually shows up, the scratching that is part of the letters shows up on the vertical face where that break took place, and even up against it. What that says to me is the writing must have occurred after that exfoliation, that popping off of that surface happened. So whoever wrote this with those black spaces already there and wrote right through it, because otherwise that's what the rock would look like. But you'll notice there is virtually no repatination over that basalt. So in other words, those exfoliations couldn't have happened a very long time ago. Again, maybe 100 years, maybe 150 years, but not thousands of years. So if you put that all together, we see that there is just no conceivable way. My hypothesis is that this could not be ancient. It can't be old because of what the surface of the rock actually looks like. Beyond that, and going back to my main theme here, is there any evidence of Hebrew settlements of members of the lost tribes of Israel in west central New Mexico 1,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago? Archaeology is done in the Middle East all the time. We know what those settlements look like. If we take those folks and move them to New Mexico, we would expect, again, by tradition, the same kinds of artifacts, the same kinds of practices in housing and in ceramics that we see back in the Middle East. And archaeologists have worked long and hard in the Southwest, and they find lots of interesting stuff. They don't find any evidence of the lost tribes of Israel in New Mexico. All right, how about Ohio, though? It's 1860 in Ohio. David Wyrick, there's the Ricoli stones. David Wyrick is, well, back then, virtually everybody is an amateur archaeologist, but Wyrick is interested in who built the mounds. You know, this was a major controversy in American archaeology, who was responsible for building the mounds early on. It wasn't until really the 1880s and the Smithsonian Institution did this marvelous broad-scale survey, and Cyrus Thomas was the author of the survey results, and he came to the conclusion that no, Native Americans had built the burial mounds and the effigy mounds. We'll talk about effigy mound in a little bit, and the temple mounds that are so prevalent in the American Midwest and Mid-South. Well, Ryrick is excavating one of these burial mounds, and that's the artifact he finds in the burial mound. Now, if you're looking closely at that, you'll notice, well, that looks like Hebrew. And it does. It looks like Hebrew. If you were to open a Hebrew Bible today that was English and Hebrew, the lettering in that Bible would look a lot like that lettering. There are 4 faces to it, and that's what they look like. And what they say is, it can be translated, Holy of Holies, King of the Earth, Law of God, the Word of God. Well, Wyrick he was incredibly excited about this, thinking, well, I've solved the mound builder mystery. The mounds were built by ancient Hebrews who came to America 2,000 years ago. Well, not so fast. He brought it to a university-trained archaeologist. It's called the Keystone. Charles Whittlesey. He immediately declared it to be a fake. You know why? This is the wrong kind of Hebrew. That is, the Hebrew that you find in a Bible today is a modern version of Hebrew that goes back maybe 100 or 200 years. That's not the kind of Hebrew people were writing 2,000 years ago. So Whittlesey said, nah, the thing is totally bogus. What's interesting is I was on a committee at my university, and on that committee was a librarian who was Jewish and Orthodox, and he knew Hebrew. And so I was bringing a version of that artifact. I showed a picture of the artifact to him, and he said, "What is that?" And I was explaining the story. His immediate reaction was, when I told him it's a 2,000-year-old burial mound, he said, "That's the wrong kind of Hebrew." He didn't know any more of the story than that. That's the wrong kind of Hebrew. A rabbi in New York, in the New York Times, about that artifact, a month after it was found. It's the bungling work of an unskilled stonemason, and the strangeness of some letters, as well as the many mistakes and transpositions, was his fault. The letters are not antique. This is not a relic of hoary antiquity. I have a knockoff of the Keystone. I was granted this, I was given this as a gift by my colleague, Brad Lepper, who's an archaeologist in Ohio, who I will mention later on in relation to Serpent Mound. This is ceramic, right? It's a copy of the keystone. So it's a fake of the fake artifact that people recognize was fake. He gave this to me after I gave a lecture at an archaeology center in Western Ohio called Sunwatch Village. And I gave a lecture there. I was just overnight. They wrapped it in bubble wrap for me, and I put it in my carry-on luggage and went to the airport in Dayton the next day to go home to Connecticut through Pittsburgh. And so put the bag on was going through the security and put the bag on the conveyor belt, and everything stopped. And those moments, if you've experienced those, you know what I'm talking about, where everything stops. Oh man, some idiot left a water bottle in their carry-on. Some idiot's got like a Swiss Army knife there. And you're looking around to see who's the idiot. Turns out I was the idiot. I looked at, they had my bag separated. They called me over, said, "Sir, maybe look in your bag." And I said, "Yeah." I hadn't put it together yet. He opened it up and he immediately picked up that artifact, fake artifact, wrapped in bubble wrap. He said, "Sir, may I take the bubble wrap off?" And I said, "Yeah." And he took it off and he held the fake of the keystone in his hand. And he said, "Sir, would you care to explain what this is?" I answered the only way I could. I said, "Well, it's kind of a funny story." And he said, "Well, okay, let's hear it." And I gave him a version of the story I am telling you right here, right? And what was interesting to me anyway was, I think it's a fascinating story. Apparently, so did all the other TSA agents. They gathered around me to hear the story. I am telling you the truth. One of the agents asked me if she could pull out a notebook so she could take notes because she wanted to get the story right when she told her family. I said, "Yeah, sure." So she's taking they should have gotten continuing education credits for listening to me expound on the Newark Holy Stone. It was great. I packed it all up. As I left, one of the other agents came over to me and said, "This is the Dayton airport. Nothing interesting ever happens here. Thank you for the best story I've had working here for 5 years." I said, "Glad to be of service." So along with not putting a bottle of water or a Swiss Army knife in your carry-on, never put in a fake archaeological artifact in your carry-on, because you'll get snared by TSA agents every time. That's the real one. Now I've superimposed it over my fake. So here's what's interesting. Once these scholars told Weyrich, "Nope, it's the wrong kind of Hebrew," that was June. November of the same year, a few miles away, he finds this at a burial site, a burial mound. This is a version of the Ten Commandments, and it's a much more chronologically correct version of Hebrew, if we're saying the mounds are like 2,000 years old, and these were ancient Jews who came to America to build these burial mounds. It's curious, isn't it, that the same guy who found the fake artifact now finds one that looks a lot more real within a few miles of one another, within a few months. Whoever faked this whoever faked the keystone learned their lesson. It's one of the problems that archaeologists have in assessing fakes, is that so often we effectively, in debunking a fake, we give a primer on how you can do a better job of faking it. And I think that's what happened here in Ohio. This, by the way, was made from a local slate. It's not from the Middle East. This is a local slate in Ohio, which is a very common material used in gravestones. So you could go to the nearest cemetery in Newark, Ohio, and find gravestones made of exactly this same material. If you look, the Hebrew on the Decalogue stone looks a lot more similar to the Hebrew on the Los Lunas Decalogue stone. So I think what's going on, this is 19th century especially. There is a huge interest in who built the burial mounds, and one of the things people kept coming up with again and again and again with the Bat Creek stone and a number of other artifacts was that it was ancient lost tribes of Israel, members of the lost tribes of Israel. That's how they're lost. They sailed across the Atlantic and they landed in America. But I'll ask the same question I asked before. So in Ohio, tons of archaeology being done. Oh, the Ohio History Connection, which was the Ohio Historical Society, which is a semi-government agency. They've been doing archaeology for decades and decades and decades, and people have been collecting artifacts for decades and decades. And guess what, folks? No one has ever found any evidence of the mundane, everyday stuff that an archaeologist would expect from a settlement of ancient Jewish settlers of Ohio from 2,000 years ago. There's absolutely none of that kind of evidence. So the evidence I've been talking about right from the very beginning, the mundane stuff that people make and use and throw away, following tradition, it simply isn't there. The archaeological verdict in that case is always going to be unproven. Now we're going to change gears entirely. I'm going to talk about our place that I just absolutely love. This is Black Dragon Canyon. It's in Utah, and it's located in the middle of the state. And it's located in this gorgeous geological feature called the San Rafael Swell, which is like 60 square miles, I think, of this geological uplift. And because it's softer stone on top, canyons have been eroding all throughout. It looks like a spider web from the air. It's beautiful. And the area was used very regularly by native people who viewed this gorgeous place as sacred. And they left behind their sacred messages in the many canyons and alleyways of the San Rafael Swell. So we arrived there, walked through this narrow canyon, this little slot, which opened up into a large amphitheater. This is all natural, and this vast expanse of sandstone. You already can see some of the artwork. And these are not petroglyphs, these are pictographs. So these are painted images on this surface. So there's that one on the left. I'm going to show you close-ups of these. This one here on the right, and the one in the middle is the one that's really important for my archaeological oddities. These are anthropomorphs. They kind of look like people, but the one in the middle doesn't have a head. It doesn't have any arms. It's got legs, though. The white that you're seeing is modern. It's vandalism, but the intent was good. Folks thought, well, if we outline these, it's easier to see them. Don't do that. It's vandalism. But everywhere on these panels where you see the white, it's a modern addition to the artwork. So the panel all the way on the right, that one there, very cool. It looks like a person, again, no arms. This is called Barrier Canyon style, which very often has these elongated bodies, sometimes round eyes, sometimes missing limbs. It's this gorgeous style. It goes back at least 1,000 years. Some think even longer than that, 6,000 or 7,000 years. The image on the right, again, outlined by a modern chalker, is some kind of an animal, a dog or a coyote. They're beautiful. I'm speculating. We don't know. The one in the middle, though, for a few decades now, people have said, we know what the image in the middle is. And as soon as you see it in close-up, you probably can guess. Use your imagination, your wild imagination. And what do you think people think that is? Yep, a pterodactyl. So that, in other words, a couple thousand years ago, 1,000 years ago, maybe as much as 7,000 years ago, native people in Ohio must have looked up in that piercingly blue southwest sky and they saw pterodactyls flying around. I guess that at least is the claim. And you will see that if you look up on the internet, Black Dragon Canyon, especially creationist sites that believe that the world is only 6,000 years old and that people and dinosaurs lived at the same time. You will see people parroting this claim over and over again. What I've done here is I've boosted up the contrast. So that's a little bit fake. So you can see it better. And the white there was outlined by, again, somebody thinking, yeah, this would be cool to do that. I have then not at the site, but obviously on my screen, I have outlined the image of the pterodactyl in black. Now, here's the deal, folks. Seriously, that looks like one really messed up pterodactyl. First of all, his right wing, the one on the left, is all humpy bumpy. What's that about? His left wing, the one on the right here, from your perspective, is super, super thin and narrow. And the feet are facing in the opposite direction, I think, than what you would have expected. And the face and the head and the beak, I guess that is, it just doesn't look like a very accurate representation of a pterodactyl. The reason why, as I can show you conclusively, it's not. It's a fake. Not the original image. The original image is real, but the imposition of this vision of a pterodactyl is completely fake and really irresponsible. I took this from a website. The headline over the picture is "The Black Dragon Canyon Pterosaur is still soaring." So these are people who believe still this is a pterodactyl, this is a pterosaur. Now, I hope you notice something. Whoever made this image completely fabricated what it looks like. This is not what the image looks like. But I've been there, I've seen it, I showed you the pictures. That's not it. Notice how they have filled in what clearly were gaps in the painting. I'm going to show you that in just a little bit. This is a misrepresentation. This is a lie. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. This is lying. Here's why. All right, here's the image. Do you see those white lines connecting the left wing and the body? What do you notice? It's completely artificial. There's no connection between that image on the right of the slide and what you see there on the left. I'll give you a close-up. And even better, see that area right there? There's no paint there. There's no connection. The same is true, equally so, right there. There's nothing there. So what people have done, what they've conflated here, is they've taken what effectively is 3 separate images and tried to force you to see it as one big, really troubled pterodactyl. Now, the best part here is that just a few years ago, a team actually led by some Europeans came to Black Dragon Canyon pterodactyl, and they applied modern technology that's able to isolate the chemicals in the pigments and to show where the pigment really is and where it isn't, and then to reconstruct the images. And here's what that is. How cool is that? What you have actually are 5 images. The bighorn sheep there on the left, I don't see those in the original image at all, but they were able to isolate it using the technology they applied. But what you see on the right is not the wing of a pterodactyl. It's a snake. It's a horned snake. If you don't like snakes, and I'm not crazy about snakes, horned snakes is like the worst. They're the worst. They're in Utah. That's a real animal. Don't go to Utah if you don't want to see any horned snakes. The image, the middle image on the right there, that looks like the person, it looks like a person with his arms out. That's exactly what it is. And then the left wing of the pterodactyl, which includes those sheep, is another anthropomorph, another human-like, who is leading in the other direction. That's Jean-Louis Lequelec, who was the leader of this expedition. It was published in Antiquity, which is a journal in England, which should have been done by Americans, but whatever. It's an amazing piece of artwork, but it is absolutely scandalous that anybody would try to reimagine what native people were actually producing, their creativity, their genius, and try to make it into something else. To me, this is like somebody going over to looking at any famous Whistler's mother and saying, no, I'd like that to be a couple of kids at a roller skating rink, and then just drawing in all the parts to make it look like that. it was disrespectful for anybody to try to convince people that this is a pterodactyl, because that's not obviously what it was. Oh, and do paleontologists ever find evidence of pterodactyls with Native American artifacts side by side in Utah? That's a big no. So again, there's no archaeological evidence to support the claim that these guys are alive at the same time human beings are alive. It's not a pterodactyl. Yeah, the Flintstones is not a documentary. It's the Flintstones it's a cartoon. Now, Sago Canyon. So if you're not happy about pterodactyls, how about extraterrestrial aliens? Sago Canyon, another artwork panel in Utah. This may be one of the most impressive art panels I've ever seen. Again, probably a couple thousand years old, could be more than that. It's those individual images, those kind of people-y things, those are all 5 or 6 feet high. So this is gigantic, it's huge, and it's multiple individuals. And what the extraterrestrial alien crowd claims is that these are in fact extraterrestrial aliens in spacesuits, no less. Now, don't take my word for it. This is the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell, New Mexico. This is a panel in that museum. See that where the green arrow on the left is pointing to that image? There's a blow up of it. Well, you just saw those pictographs because I showed them to you at Sago Canyon. And what the captioning here says is that these may be spacesuited aliens. These may be people from outer space. Or when you talk to the folks who are the descendants of the people who produced these, they will tell you they are spirit beings. So I will go with what the native people say because it's their ancestors who produced it, and not what people at the International UFO Museum say. Again, it's appropriating Native American material to reconstruct a fantasy that has been around since even before Eric von Däniken wrote Chariots of the Gods in the 1960s. Again, any physical evidence at Roswell or anywhere that a flying saucer crashed in New Mexico and aliens got out and native people drew them on walls, there's zero evidence for that entirely. Now, I wasn't going to announce this. I'm trying to keep this secret for a long time. But, you know, I feel that America is ready to hear this. The world is ready to hear this. You know that flying saucer that crashed in New Mexico, 1947? A lot of skeptics say it never happened. This Fader guy, that's me, said it never happened. Well, I'm here to confess something right now. I was aboard that spacecraft. That's me in front of my friends. They all died. I survived. That's our spacecraft in the background. I know that looks like we got it at like Toys R Us, but no, that's our actual spacecraft. This is the exhibit at the UFO Museum where they're trying to be taken seriously, I think. And it's a great museum exhibit because you push a button and it spins around and smoke comes out of it. And you'll notice I'm the only alien who seems to be wearing any clothing, or maybe they're wearing clothing. I'm not exactly sure. Again, there actually was, believe it or not, an archaeological excavation at the place that was supposed to be where the flying saucer crashed. Again, goose eggs. There's no physical evidence for that. So again, from the archaeological perspective, the archaeological mindset is something happens, there's going to be material remains, there's going to be artifacts. We even can predict what should be found if we're gonna support that hypothesis. Nothing in Roswell. Closer to my home, this is in New Hampshire. It's been called Patty's Caves, Mystery Hill, America's Stonehenge. It's in New Hampshire, up there. And this is supposed to be, by the claim of the folks who owned the site for years and years and years, an ancient Celtic settlement in New Hampshire that goes back 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 years. It's for sure idiosyncratic, really cool. And the claim is that the Druids had something to do with it. Druids were not an ethnic group. They are a religious order among the Celts, the Celtic people. like 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 years ago. They've got this like kind of really romantic vibe now. That began in the 19th century, where they're like spiritualists and they're hooked into nature, and there's something supernatural and paranormal about them. That has no bearing in reality. That's not really who the Druids were, but nevertheless, the claim is that the Druids were in New Hampshire. There's an object in the site, and the people who own it, they think they know what it is, to the sacrificial table. Okay? That's what it looks like. It's about 6.5 feet from top to bottom there, maybe 5 feet or so on the side, and there's a channel, a groove carved into the surface. Looks like from there. Now, the claim that it was used in human sacrifice by the Druids really only dates back, that whole notion that the Druids were sacrificing people on tables is a 19th century fantasy. There isn't even any archaeological evidence in the old world for that. This is an engraving. I love this. I want a big copy of this for my office, right? You know, framed. Human sacrifice by a Gaulish Druid, Felix Philippetot, 1851. It's just another example of this. I know romantic is a weird word to use, but it is. I think there's a version of the word romantic that applies here, that it was just, again, the Druids sacrificing people, believing that that was what would lead to the world continuing the way it was. And here, this poor dude is on the table. There's a knife in his chest. I think it was very nice of the Druids to carve that little section out of the stone to make it like comfortable when they were cutting his throat. And the Druid in the middle is collecting the blood in a chalice for some ungodly rite. There are skulls at the bottom there representing previous sacrifice victims, and there are the kind of the average Celts who are there in the background. Now, this is supposed to be happening in France, in England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. But the claim is being made that these folks made it to New Hampshire and were doing the same thing. This is another example of that. Again, that these images are all pretend. They're cosplaying being a Druid. The archaeological evidence does not support this. The one on the bottom right is obviously not a painting. It's real people, I hopefully playing about sacrificing that poor woman who was on the slab of stone. Again, archaeological evidence in the old world for this? Nope. Archaeological evidence in New Hampshire? Well, that's the claim. Is there blood evidence? What kinds of things are archaeologists going to look for? If this place was bathed in blood, archaeologists have recovered blood from stone, been able to even conduct DNA analysis on stone. I don't think a blood analysis has ever been done here. But if you're claiming there's blood, you should do that, should make an effort. Back to the archaeology. Is there any stuff found in America's Stonehenge? And there was an archaeological excavation of the site in the 1950s. More than 9,000 artifacts were recovered, including some Native American tools, lots of 18th and 19th century artifacts. In other words, there was a lot of stuff. The wax vesta supporting the hypothesis that it was ancient Druids. The many wax vestas should be artifacts. Sherlock Holmes would say, if the Celts were here, we should find diagnostically Celtic artifacts. And among the 9,000 artifacts that a colleague of mine, who I actually got to meet towards the end of his life, Gary Vasilius, that he excavated this site, of the 9,000 artifacts, how many were those of ancient Druids or Celts? Just in case you're not clear on it, none, nada, zilch, zero. Well, that's just impossible. The gold standard in archaeology is always going to be material evidence, mundane evidence, showing, yeah, people were here. They left behind stuff. There's none of that. But we do know that the stone at America's Stonehenge is not unique. This is from Hadley, Massachusetts. There's the exit. That, by the way, is my son, who's now like 37 or 38. He was about 5 then. If you're an archaeologist, it's good to have kids because they serve as good scales. And you can put them up against something, and everybody knows about how big a 5-year-old is. I told Josh this really brutal story of human sacrifice, and then I thought it would be cute if I had him lie down on the stone, and I would take a picture of him. that was a dumb thing for me to do. That was a dumb dad joke because he just looked at me and said, I don't want to. Oh, Josh, I'm not going to sacrifice you really, but we'll use him as a scale standing up next to it. This is another one. My God, are they sacrificing people all over New England? No. This is Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts. There's the exit. We know what those stones are. We know what the Mystery Hill, American Stonehenge stone, most likely was. A cider press bedstone. We don't make cider this way anymore, so that we've got this kind of amnesia about how cider was made in the 17, 18, and 1800s. This is a cider press from Sturbridge Village. Everything's wooden, but you notice that stone, the thing at the bottom, the bed, it's wood, but gee, it looks a little bit like that Mystery Hill stone because of, look at the channels and the exit. This is an example from the UK. This is a photograph from the Cider Museum in Hereford, which I think is right on the Welsh and English border. So that's an old-timey cider mill. It's a screw press. You can see it. There's a stone looking a lot like the American Stonehenge stone on the bottom. That burlap is holding crushed apple. And so the burlap is going to act as a filter to filter out the seeds and the inedible parts, the stems, the skin. And when you screw those, there's an actual platform that's not in this photograph that pushes down against the burlap, squeezes out the juice. You can see it in this example. No, you can't. You can see it in the next example. That mill in the background is where they crush the apples. There's your stone from America Stonehenge. It's very similar. And here's the example. Here's it actually working as they are squeezing. They're turning those screws that pushes down the weight that squeezes out all of the juice. So there are no Druid, no Celtic artifacts in New Hampshire. The artifact that is of such importance looks just like a host of artifacts for which we have a mundane explanation. When I had so much wonderful cooperation from Elizabeth Pimblett, who's the director of the Cider Museum in the UK, and she wanted to know why a prehistorian, an archaeologist in the United States, was so interested in getting photographs of their operation in that museum. And I told her, well, there's this site in New Hampshire where they've got one of these stones. They say it's used for ritual blood sacrifice. Her response was fantastic. She says, that is something I've never heard before. A sacrificial stone. How utterly stupid. You hear that in a British accent, and it makes a lot of sense. By the way, talk about weird. The cider press bedstone at America Stonehenge was vandalized by QAnon. Yeah, QAnon people actually tore into it. That Jeb Card, my colleague in Ohio, figured out that the guy carved into the base was WWG 1WGA. Where we go is one, we go all. And up on top, this poor sorry guy, I am Mark, is this guy's his Instagram or Twitter handle. He was easy to track down. He got arrested. He believed that this stone was being used today in ritually sacrificing children to collect their blood for the adrenochrome. It's so bizarre, I think we'll just sort of leave it at that. No evidence supporting that claim. Serpent Mound, I'm going to rush through these. Beautiful effigy mound in Ohio in the shape of a giant snake. It's a 19th century image of the serpent. It's 1,350 feet from the tip of its tail to its gaping jaws. There's a Google Earth photograph. I've been there. It's really cool. There's a little like fire stand where you can climb upstairs and get a good look at it from above. And it's very impressive. It's part of a state park. I'm not going to talk a lot about Graham Hancock. He gets enough stuff thrown at him by archaeologists, but he does devote a part of one of the shows of his Ancient Apocalypse, of the eight individual episodes. And one of them he devotes to a part of it to Serpent Mound, this very, very mound. And he describes it, the way he describes this, one of its most stunning attributes, one that mainstream archaeologists don't like to acknowledge because, again, it involves it involves the sky. You overfly Serpent Mound on the summer solstice around June 21st. You'll immediately notice that the jaws of the serpent are aligned almost directly to the point where the sun sets. So he's come up with this notion that it's astronomically aligned. I mentioned Brad Lepper before. This is, again, these are direct quotes from Hancock. Is archaeology taking the archaeoastronomy of the site seriously? It's as though mainstream archaeologists want us to believe that all these astronomical alignments happen by accident. This is an article written by my buddy Brad Lepper in 1998 called The Great Serpent. And all of the alignments that Hancock is revealing to the world that we're trying to hide, they're in Brad's article in 1998, and he got it. It actually was first published 10 years before that by a couple of avocational archaeologists, good for them, and another professional archaeologist. But my goodness, I try not to be snarky. I really do. I really do. I really do. But if you go to the site, there's a sign at the site saying the head of Serpent Mound is lined up to the point on the western horizon where the sun sets on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. If archaeologists are trying to hide this, if we're trying to not acknowledge it, we do a terrible job of it because we put up signs saying that very thing. I get loud about this because these are people I know who have worked hard to spread the word about the amazing aspects of Serpent Mound, and to be told that they're trying to hide this or not acknowledge it is, well, it's maddening. Real quick, because I know I'm out of time. Is there a lost Egyptian city in California? No, but this is sort of a funny, this is a parody. That is Cecil B. DeMille, famous movie director, made the Ten Commandments. I think that's the first movie I saw in a theater. That's 56. He actually made a silent version of it in 1923, and the set he constructed in sand dunes north of Los Angeles, the Guadalupe sand dunes. So he had to rent out this space. Again, it's a silent movie, so the fact that it's up against the water doesn't make any difference. And he built a beautiful Egyptian set. It was the most expensive movie ever made at that point. He built 20 sphinxes. He built the gates of a city. So in a place that looks like that, that's what it looks like in the film. And it's just marvelous. None of that's CGI. None of that's artificial intelligence. That's a real movie set. And here's a photo of what it looked like while they were constructing it. Now, at the end of filming, he was obliged contractually to bring all this stuff home. He ran out of money. He didn't do it. He left it there and buried it in sand. This is from his autobiography. If 1,000 years from now, archaeologists happen to dig beneath the sands of Guadalupe, I hope they will not rush into print with the amazing news that Egyptian civilization, far from being confined to the valley of the Nile, extended all the way to the Pacific coast of North America. The sphinxes they will find were buried when we had finished with them and dismantled our huge set of the gates of Pharaoh's city. And yeah, sure enough, by the 1930s, some of the sphinxes were being exposed by the winds. A local golf course owner actually found a couple of them and took them to his golf course. This is what it looks like today. Peter Brosnan deserves all the credit in the world for actually getting some funding for archaeologists to excavate this movie set. And if you're interested, at the Guadalupe de Pomo Dunes Museum, you can actually see an exhibit of the material that they excavated. So it's archaeology. It's kind of postmodern. It's the history of movie making. Just an amazing place. And yep, Brosnan, who was a film student back in the day, made this wonderful video of it. Lots of other sites mentioned in my book. Lots of other sites I could have talked about, but I'll do that in the next hour of this lecture, which well, it's not going to happen now. And if you hated this lecture, whatever you do, don't track me down in a 10-part series exposing archaeological hoaxes. It'll be on YouTube. It's all been filmed. It's being edited. It'll be up soon. If you like this, go see some more of it. The very last slide. I know a lot of the stuff I focused here is Native American, and I just want to leave you with this. Many thanks to the Native peoples of the Americas for the spectacular legacy they bequeath to their descendants, places where modern Native people can commune with their ancestors, and where we natives can, if we listen and look with respect, revel in their wisdom and beauty. And with that, I will leave that behind and see if we have any questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Fader.
You're welcome.
My name is Dante Ferenga, and I'm the Development and Marketing Director at the San Diego Archaeological Center. Tonight, I'll be moderating the Q&A portion of the discussion. And as a reminder, you can submit your questions using the Q&A feature located on your Zoom control panel, and we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. All right. So we have a couple questions along this vein, but what advice do you have for those of us who have to interact with the public on these kinds of topics? What's the best way to combat these pseudoscientific beliefs, since explaining how and why they're wrong or going into scientific methodology usually doesn't get you anywhere?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, it's always been this kind of two-pronged approach. And one of is, debunking or responding directly to specific claims in a positive way is helpful. It has to be done. So when people come to me and say, "Hey, look, I think this object was made by ancient Druids who came to America," I say, "Okay, well, let's parse this out. Let's look at it under a microscope." So treat people with respect, because most of these folks really think that maybe they found something good, something interesting, and to show this is how archaeology works. This is how we assess this, and that's good. But almost more important, I think, is the proactive approach. The proactive approach for me is, let's accentuate the positive. Let's look at real archaeology and expose people to the amazing creativity and brilliance and ingenuity of ancient people. If you're in America, ancient Native people, and that was kind of the thing that inspired me to write the Ancient America book, and now my more recent one, which is Native American Archaeology in Parks, National Monuments and National Parks, was to explicitly go to say, look, I know there's a lot of confusion and a lot of misrepresentation and just a lot of questions. Here's what we actually know about these incredible places. And I'm explicit throughout that, look, there's no need for ancient aliens or Atlanteans, because we have the evidence here of this developing slowly through time. We don't see any direct evidence of that. It's this focus on evidence, that you can make up lots of stories, but ultimately, as an archaeologist, as a scientist, as a historian, it all depends on the evidence. And in my experience, I tell you what, in my experience, the true believers are few and far between, and you're never going to convince them. The people who really know, they've got a lot of experience in archaeology, they don't need convincing. But it's most people in between see stuff about Atlantis or ancient aliens or Graham Hancock, and it's really interesting. And these things are, the Ancient Apocalypse series was very well filmed, and Hancock is an articulate man. He's a very smart man, and those ideas, those notions come out very seductive, and you can't say they're not interesting. But as an archaeologist, again, it's don't make fun, don't belittle, but say, okay, let's look at this specifically. And once you get on that roll, the folks who basically are interested but don't know, I think you'll get most of them to understand, all right, maybe I don't agree that there's no chance of this, but I see where you're coming from. There again, if you go on YouTube, you'll find Joe Rogan Experience, a debate between Graham Hancock and my colleague in archaeology, Flint Dibble. Yep, that's his name. His father was an archaeologist, and he named his son Flint. And Flint did an amazing job, again, of not attacking, not belittling, but sharing what the archaeological record actually provides to us. And I think a lot of even Graham Hancock fans went away saying, okay, I still hope that there was an ancient lost civilization. I still think there may have been, but I see where archaeologists are coming from about the need for evidence and the lack of that evidence.
And I'm kind of curious, since at least at our museum, we're starting to see more of a rise of the general public approaching us with these pseudoscientific views. Are you seeing a rise in that, or have you experienced this trend for years?
Okay, my answer is a sad one. I'm old. I'm 71. And so what that means is I got good time depth on this. In my experience, it's a curve that rises and then falls and rises and falls. And with each rise in the curve of acceptance of pseudoscience, it may be a different idea. It may be ancient aliens, and then it's Atlantis, and then it's a lost civilization. And I don't think we're ever going to eliminate that. These ideas are super interesting. Listen, I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronomer, and I read books about extraterrestrial life. And if tomorrow somebody found, like, I don't know, a ray gun or a part of a flying saucer under the pyramid of Cheops in Egypt, I would be stoked. I would think that's really cool. But I'm angry if you're trying to fool me about it because I don't see the evidence. So my answer to you, my long-winded answer is, right now we're in a rise, but we may peak at some point and there'll be a decline again. But it never goes to zero, and at something more captivating will come along and it'll rise again. And that's how they make cable shows. Just to kind of extemporize here, I was approached twice by independent production companies about perhaps hosting a cable series about archaeology. And I thought my 50 Sites book would be perfect. That we have 10 episodes. Each episode, we go to 5 real deal archaeological sites and show how amazing they are, and talk to the archaeologists who worked at that sites to explain how we know, no, it's not Atlantis. No, it's not a lost civilization. No, it's not ancient aliens. It's the people who actually live there who are responsible. And in both cases, independently, those production people, the producers, wanted to know, well, are any of these sites, do they have treasure there, or are there mysteries? And again, when I'm putting a bind there, I come up with great ideas. I said, well, the treasures are the knowledge we gain by excavating these sites, and the mystery is why more people don't know about them. Well, they weren't buying what I was selling. And that's what sells commercials. Unfortunately, in so many of these documentaries or pseudo documentaries, it's what generates clicks, what generates viewership, at least right now in America, are things that are mysteries, that involve treasures, and that go against what we evil mainstream archaeologists, what we think and what we say. And it's a product of our times, and I don't know that there's anything we can do about it directly, except create our own content. Now, there's so many ways of getting that out there. In some small way, I hope my 10-part series that'll be on YouTube, it'll be free, that will in some way get the pseudo-archaeologists really angry at me. But in most ways, I hope people look at that and go, okay, I get where archaeologists are coming from now. So because of YouTube and a number of other, TikTok or whatever, we have options for creating our own content. Whether we'll ever get the kind of viewership they get on cable, I don't know. But at least it's a good strategy.
And then we have a few questions about specific myths.
Sure.
Does archaeological evidence support the Druids sacrificing people in Scotland?
Here's my funny answer to that is, when I first started studying the sacrificial table in New Hampshire, those are scare quotes. I went on Google and I searched because I wanted to see, were there Druid tables, were there sacrificial tables in Europe that kind of would be the model for what I saw at America Stonehenge. And when you type that in, the first, I don't know how many, to Google the image, Google images, the first 10 or 11 of them were all photographs. And I typed in United Kingdom, ancient Druids, sacrifice tables. And the pictures that came up were the table in New Hampshire. And I said, no, it can't be the source of its own imagery. What a lot of scholars, not all, but what a lot of Druidic scholars of the Druid people, and the ancient Celts, what they say is the Romans were all about, they invaded the Northern Europe, and they were all about fake news. They wanted to show the people back home that the native folks of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, England, France were savages and barbarians. And so one interpretation, one hypothesis is all that sacrificial stuff, they made it up for their audience back home. So again, I've searched, I see some hint that, yeah, maybe the Druids did sacrifice people, but it doesn't seem to have been like a major part of their culture, and there's not a lot of physical evidence to support it.
And then can you speak to the giants of California?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the giants of California. Here's where my interest in giants starts. In New York State, there was, in the 1860s, a guy found a giant petrified man on his farm. It's called the Cardiff Giant. It was completely fake, but what it was based on were the biblical stories of the Nephilim, in which, in one translation of I guess it's Aramaic, that the Old Testament was written in one translation it's giants, in another translation it's not. There has long been, I know in California, are they the red-haired giants? There's an undercurrent of lots of stories about Native Americans talking about there being giants, and of giant skeletons being found in archaeological sites in California, but also throughout the American Midwest. None of those skeletons can be shown. None of them are real. The story gets so weird that the Smithsonian confiscated all the skeletons and they destroyed them. There are lots of cultures with stories about giants, not necessarily meaning that there ever were actual physical giants. Again, from the perspective of, an empirical skeptic like myself, find me a skeleton that's 10 feet tall and I'll admit, yep, there were 10-foot tall giants. But nobody has done that yet. And so as a result, great stories, big stories in the Grand Canyon as well. There are some geological features in the Grand Canyon that late 19th century, people were saying, we've seen them. They are the giant petrified remains of human beings. And when geologists went to look, they found geological features that if you kind of closed one eye and squinted and looked cockeyed at it, it kind of sort of could look like a giant. So again, physical evidence, zero.
All right, and we have several Sherlock Holmes fans on here too, besides you. So we have someone with an associate's degree in anthropology who loves Sherlock Holmes and finds investigations fascinating. Do you recommend any specific career paths?
Yes, become a consulting detective. Open up a little shop in London, and there you go. I mean, if you've got an associate's degree, I can't tell you what the job market is in California, but here in the East, cultural resource management is your fundamental career path with a bachelor's or a master's degree. So that is to get hired by, and companies are hiring people that do CRM work, so that when archaeological research is required or mandated by federal law, because you're going to put in a new highway and it conceivably will disturb a large swath of land, and maybe there are archaeological sites there. So I know it's tough to be a shovel bum and you don't make a whole ton of money, and I don't know about benefits. And I know that in some places those CRM, cultural resource management archaeologists, are unionizing, and things will probably get better. But that is a decent way to enter into the field. For people who are interested in archaeology, I've had students who've gone through and got bachelor's degrees and then end up getting jobs at high schools teaching social studies, and they bring archaeology into their topics. And some of them actually conduct archaeological research, often with the help of university archaeologists. So there's just the deal with archaeology is you have to sort of be creative and make your own way. But the easiest entry there, and again, I can't speak to the job market in California if that's where you're from, but doing federally mandated or state mandated surveys, get out of the ground floor, dig a lot of test holes, sift a lot of soil, end up with really bad knees and a couple of crushed vertebrae, and you're on your way.
All right. And speaking of Sherlock Holmes, I think you have an old friend here who wants to know when your Holmes novella, The Murder of Piltdown Man, will be published.
Hey, Nico, how you doing, man? I know exactly how that is. Strange story, right? I mean, this guy and his two brothers were students of mine. It's got to be 30 years ago, and I'm in touch with them, and they are just, they've been an enormous influence on my life, man. These guys are smart, they are wise, and they are curious about everything. And I argue with this guy all the time about flying saucers. So here's the deal, Nico. The frauds, the 11th edition of Frauds is about to come out, and after that, man, I've got open sky for putting that together. So thank you for reminding me. I need him to remind me regularly that I should get off of my butt and put that thing out. It's archaeology, physical anthropology, evolution, and Sherlock Holmes.
All right. And we have plenty of comments just saying how much they enjoyed tonight's talk.
Listen, I loved talking to you folks. Thank you so much for being so patient with me, going on and on and on. So we're going to break for 10 minutes and we'll be back for another hour. I'm lying. It's like 10:30 here, so I better go to sleep.
And we did even have a former TSA officer who really got a kick out of your TSA story.
My God, that's, yeah, and no, 100% true. Every word of that story was true.
All right, and then we're almost out of time, but finally, are there any unproven hypotheses that you believe in?
I believe that for every drop of rain that falls, a flower grows. That was actually, I think that was a song. It's just kind of sappy. You know, I mean, it's such a hard question to answer. I don't know. The answer is no. Are there mysteries out there that are just aching to be explained? You betcha. Lots of them. But I do not. But in every one of those cases, I'm left with shrugging my shoulders and saying, but there's no evidence for it. So it's for an archaeologist, it's material based, it's evidence based. And it's only when there's evidence forthcoming that I'll say, okay, you've tested that hypothesis, you've led support for it. I'm no longer skeptical. But until then, nah.
All right. Well, thank you again for your time tonight.
Again, thank you, everybody. I appreciated you coming out here. And again, if you're interested, every once in a while, check on YouTube, check under my name, check on archaeological hoaxes, check on Colorado State Archaeologist, and you'll see those 10 episodes being made live, hopefully in the not too distant future.
All right. And thank you also to everyone for attending tonight's living room lecture. For more information on our upcoming events, please visit our website, sandiegoarchaeology.org. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes.